Now, a person who knows all about this better than anyone is a former Green Beret. He is the president of the Valhalla Project, which is a project dedicated to helping those that have helped us stay free, returning vets from the battlefield to and acclimating them, reacclimating them to their home and that transition. If you look for a man who has served this country and continues to serve us in the way he serves those that have served and continue to serve, it's Colonel Gordon Cucullu. Wrote one of his books, third and most recent, Warrior Police, Rolling with America's Military Police in the World's Troubled Spots, is a book that he wrote with his best half, Chris. And he joins us now to discuss the happenings in the Ukraine and overall the military budget cuts as well will hit. Colonel, welcome back. How are you?
Oh, doing well. Thank you, Crane. Glad to be on with you this evening.
It's always good to be with you, sir. And I wanted to play cut number 47 for you because this is what Susan Rice said earlier this week when she said she had no regrets about Benghazi and then was asked about the situation with Vladimir Putin and the Ukrainian government. Roll it.
That would be a grave mistake. It's not in the interests of Ukraine or of Russia or of Europe or the United States to see the country split. It's in nobody's interest to see violence return and the situation escalate. There is not an inherent contradiction, David, between a Ukraine that has long-standing historic and cultural ties to Russia and a modern Ukraine that wants to integrate more closely with Europe.
Now, the president expressed today from the podium that he's deeply concerned about the reports of military movements taken by the Russian Federation inside the Ukraine, and the U.S. will stand with the international community in affirming that there will be costs for any military intervention in the Ukraine. He said he did not detail what those costs would be, another line drawn. Colonel, if you're advising President Obama,
please don't put me in that position. How about resign now? I don't know. It would make the most sense. The clip you played from Rice is absolutely. If this wasn't so tragic, if it didn't involve people's lives, it could be on Comedy Central. She's saying, "Oh, it's in no one's interest." Well, yes, it is. It's in Putin's interest. It's definitely in Putin's interest. Why don't we, let's be big enough to express that. Of course it's in Putin's interest. He's trying to rebuild the Russian Empire. When the wall came down and the republics went independent, Putin said it was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Obviously, he's been working very hard, diligently, and quite successfully, if truth be known, to put that empire back together. He's already stalemated us in Georgia, where he took over the South Ossetia. And for those who want to see a pattern, that's where to look. He's that worked, and he's redoing it right now. President Obama says there's going to be grave steps, serious consequences, if military action happens in Ukraine. Well, guess what? Russian Spetsnaz have now taken over the airport in Sevastopol. They're into Crimea. This is prime territory for the Russians, Crane, because that part of Ukraine, the south and the east, are primarily Russian-speaking, and so it's easy for them to infiltrate. It's easy for them to get people out on the streets waving Russian flags and saying, "We'd rather be Russian than Ukrainian." And meanwhile, the Ukrainians couldn't have been in a more vulnerable position because they just kicked the one autocrat out who was Putin's sock puppet, and they're in the midst of trying to put together something else to replace that. Meanwhile, we've got this international hand-wringing conference led from behind by President Obama, and featuring the EU, the UN, and every other international organization. They're all going to be saying, "Oh, this is terrible, this is terrible," and then they'll look for him to be out on the golf range next week. We're not going to do anything here. Putin's going to take half Ukraine, laugh at us, and it's going to be another embarrassment for the United States internationally.
When do we have to pay this bill for this type of weakness? When do we feel it? We recognizing the fact that the Ukrainian people and people who desire to be free are allies. I mean, the Poles, we bailed on them with the missile shield. The Czech Republic, I mean, we've bailed on our being leader of the free world, leading from behind now. Question, when do we feel the impact? Because on 9/11, we felt the impact of ignoring that the Islamic radical Islam was at war with us, and they were killing our guys and continue. I mean, the butcher's bill grew and grew and grew, and then it hit on 9/11. When will we feel the impact of this type of weakness?
Well, that's a really cogent and immediate question, but your underlying assumption is absolutely correct. At some point, the impact will be felt. The butcher's bill will have to be paid. And if we learn from history, the longer we delay any sort of deterrent movement, any sort of strength to convince these revanchist dictatorships like Putin that it seriously is not in their best interest to do this kind of thing, then the cheaper it'll be. But the longer we wait, the longer we delay and convince ourselves that we can really live with this new situation, the more expensive it gets. And the lead up into World War II is a classic historical example of how continued appeasement and continued deferring of any kind of decisive action will lead you in the end into a much more expensive conflict than if you did something. It wouldn't have to be necessarily an act of war. It could simply be an act of strength. But what's Putin to think when Secretary Hagel of the Defense Department has just announced that we're going to cut our military back to pre-World War II levels? That we're going to get ready to march on Russia? I don't think so.
And Colonel, I want to get to Hegel, but before I get to that, I want to go to your book, Separated at Birth, and why one of the reasons you wrote about those who fought, obviously your family, to honor your father, to honor those who have served this great country, but in the forgotten war, as it's been called. And I get the idea, you just referenced history, but you are a person dedicated, not patronizing you, this is reality, to serving this country and understanding freedom and what it means to defend it and the consequences of not defending it. Was one of the reasons you wrote that book was also to serve history, to recognize how important it is that this book is written? Is that one of the things that you personally did with your first book?
Yes, absolutely. I felt like it was a chronicle that hadn't been done before, and that it needed to be done, and that with anybody who writes any sort of history, and I'll consider myself an amateur historian, that one of the things you hope that derives from that, Crane, is that at some point people pay attention to it and realize that, as Mark Twain said, even though the history may not repeat, it does rhyme, and that it's easy to be lulled into a sense of forgetting history and forgetting the background that got us to where we are, and pretending that there's some sort of new reality on the street. And the fact of the matter is, human beings don't really change their behavior all that much. And despite what Susan Rice said on her in that silly little statement that you played earlier, violence does influence history. It's maybe the most influential factor in history singularly, and that Putin is proving right now that violence is going to triumph over words. And if all we have to offer is words, then we're going to relive it in the most painful way.